July 15, 1944. The summer sun was already rising over the hedgerows of Normandy when reports began to circulate through the headquarters of General George S. Patton, commander of the United States Third Army, as Allied forces prepared for a breakout that would decide the future of World War II. On that morning, Patton was not worried about German armor, fuel shortages, or the exhaustion of his men. Instead, his concern centered on a group of American soldiers whose presence challenged the racial order of the Army itself, men whose effectiveness on the battlefield carried consequences far beyond tactics and terrain. Black American combat units whose success or failure would echo through military policy, politics, and history itself, shaping how the United States would be judged both at home and abroad during the most destructive war the world had ever seen. In 1944, the United States Army was still segregated by race, a system enforced not by enemy pressure but by domestic policy rooted in decades of discrimination and pseudo-scientific belief. Black soldiers were officially considered inferior for frontline combat, often relegated to labor, logistics, and service roles, despite their willingness to fight. Yet World War II created a contradiction that the Army could not ignore forever, because modern mechanized warfare required manpower on a scale that ideology alone could not supply. As casualties mounted and operations expanded across Europe, commanders like Patton found themselves facing a dilemma between racial doctrine and military necessity, a conflict that would place some of the most disciplined and determined Black American soldiers directly under his command. Patton's reputation as a ruthless and brilliant commander was matched with his openly expressed racial views, which reflected the prevailing attitudes of many white officers of his generation. He believed discipline and aggression won wars, but he also believed that Black soldiers were unsuitable for combat leadership, a belief reinforced by official Army studies that claimed African Americans lacked the mental toughness required for frontline fighting. These views were not fringe opinions within the military establishment of World War II. They were embedded in training manuals, assignment policies, and promotion structures. Yet Patton was also a pragmatist, and when reality contradicted doctrine, he was capable of changing course, even if reluctantly and without abandoning his personal prejudices. The soldiers who would test Patton's assumptions were members of segregated Black units trained for combat roles that the Army had initially been hesitant to assign them. Among these units was the 761st Tank Battalion, a formation activated in 1942 and composed almost entirely of Black enlisted men led primarily by white officers. The battalion trained in the United States for nearly 2 years, enduring substandard equipment, inadequate facilities, and constant scrutiny from commanders who expected them to fail. Their training was intense, not because the Army believed in their potential, but because any mistake would be used as evidence that Black soldiers should never be allowed near the front lines of World War II. By the time the 761st arrived in Europe in October 1944, Allied forces were advancing rapidly across France, and Patton's Third Army was spearheading the push toward Germany. The general needed armored units to exploit breakthroughs and maintain momentum, but assigning a Black Tank Battalion to his command carried risks that extended beyond the battlefield. If the unit performed poorly, it would confirm racist assumptions within the Army and potentially damage morale. If it performed exceptionally well, it would challenge the very structure of segregation that the military and the nation had worked to preserve. Patton's hesitation was not fear of their weakness, but fear of the consequences their strength might bring. The soldiers of the 751st were acutely aware of the burden placed upon them. They understood that their performance would not be judged as individuals, but as representatives of an entire race. Every mechanical failure, every tactical error, and every casualty would be magnified and interpreted through the lens of segregation. This pressure forged a unit culture defined by discipline, resilience, and an uncompromising commitment to proving their worth under fire. In the context of World War II, where survival often depended on cohesion and trust, the 751st developed a bond strengthened by shared adversity and the knowledge that retreat was not an option, either militarily or symbolically. Patton eventually attached the 751st Tank Battalion to his 3rd Army in November 1944, issuing orders that reflected his conflicted attitude. He demanded absolute performance and made it clear that failure would not be tolerated, stating bluntly that he did not care what color his soldiers were as long as they killed Germans. This statement, often quoted in histories of World War II, revealed both his pragmatism and his dehumanization of the men under his command. They were valued for results, not for equality, and their acceptance depended entirely on their ability to deliver battlefield success under the harshest conditions of modern war. Once committed to combat, the 751st was thrown into some of the most brutal fighting of the European campaign. They participated in operations across France, Belgium, and Germany, including the Battle of the Bulge, where German forces launched a massive counteroffensive in December 1944. During this critical moment of World War II, Patton relied on every available unit to stem the German advance, and the black tankers of the 751st were sent into freezing forests, muddy roads, and heavily defended villages where survival was measured in hours rather than days. Their performance under these conditions would directly challenge the racial assumptions that had shaped Army policy for decades. The battalion fought continuously for over 180 days without relief, an extraordinary record by the standards of World War II armored warfare. They destroyed enemy tanks, provided infantry support under fire, and advanced through terrain that neutralized many of the advantages of American armor. Casualties were high, equipment losses were constant, and replacement crews were often rushed into battle with minimal preparation. Yet, despite these obstacles, the 751st maintained operational effectiveness, earning praise from commanders who had initially doubted their capabilities and forcing a reevaluation of what Black American soldiers could accomplish in direct combat. Patton's evolving view of the 751st did not erase his prejudices, but it did alter his behavior in ways that mattered on the battlefield. He continued to push the unit hard, assigning them demanding missions that reflected his confidence in their performance. At the same time, he remained aware that their success posed a challenge to the segregated structure of the Army. In World War II, victories were not only measured in territory gained, but in narratives shaped, and the existence of a highly effective Black combat unit threatened to undermine the ideological justification for segregation that extended beyond the military into American society itself. Beyond the 751st, other Black American units also confronted similar tensions within Patton's command, including infantry, artillery, and support formations that found themselves closer to the front lines as manpower shortages intensified. These soldiers often performed duties indistinguishable from those of white units, yet they remained subject to discriminatory treatment, restricted advancement, and limited recognition. Their experiences during World War II highlighted the contradiction between the democratic ideals the United States claimed to defend and the reality of racial inequality within its own armed forces, a contradiction that could no longer be ignored as the war approached its final stages.
The fear surrounding these soldiers was not rooted in superstition or battlefield superstition, but in institutional anxiety. Military leaders worried about the political implications of acknowledging Black combat effectiveness, particularly as reports of their performance circulated among journalists, policymakers, and civil rights organizations back home. During World War II, propaganda played a crucial role in shaping public perception, and the image of Black soldiers fighting and dying alongside white Americans challenged deeply ingrained beliefs about race, citizenship, and national identity. Patton, as a senior commander, was keenly aware that his actions would be scrutinized both during and after the war. As Allied forces crossed into Germany in 1945, the contributions of Black American soldiers became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Units that had been marginalized at the beginning of World War II now found themselves participating in the final offensives that would bring the conflict in Europe to an end. The success of these soldiers did not immediately dismantle segregation within the Army, but it laid the groundwork for post-war debates that would eventually lead to integration. Patton's role in this process was complex, marked by personal prejudice, professional pragmatism, and an unwilling acknowledgement that the realities of modern warfare had exposed the flaws in long-held assumptions. The legacy of these soldiers extends beyond their individual battles and decorations. Their service during World War II forced the United States military to confront its own contradictions and accelerated changes that might otherwise have taken decades longer to achieve. The fear they inspired was not fear of failure, but fear of transformation. Fear that proving themselves on the battlefield would demand changes in policy, perception, and power that the institution was not prepared to embrace. In confronting that fear through action rather than rhetoric, these Black American soldiers reshaped the narrative of World War II and redefined what service, sacrifice, and citizenship meant in a nation still struggling to live up to its ideals. The pressure created by this transformation did not disappear when the guns fell silent in Europe, because the implications of Black American combat performance during World War II extended far beyond Patton's headquarters or the borders of Germany. Reports compiled by the Army, letters written by officers, and after-action reviews quietly documented what could not be publicly emphasized at the time: that segregated Black units had met and often exceeded expectations under sustained combat conditions. These documents circulated within military institutions where future policy was debated, creating an undercurrent of evidence that segregation was not a matter of effectiveness, but of tradition and politics. The soldiers who had once been considered an experiment were now an inconvenient proof. Within Patton's own staff, discussions emerged that reflected this uneasy shift. Officers who had initially resisted the integration of Black units into frontline operations now found themselves relying on them to hold ground, protect flanks, and exploit breakthroughs. In the rigid hierarchy of World War II command structures, trust was earned through performance under fire, not ideology, and the repeated success of Black tank crews and infantry detachments forced a reassessment that could not be openly acknowledged but could no longer be dismissed. The battlefield had become a testing ground not only for tactics but for the assumptions that underpinned the Army itself.
For the soldiers themselves, victory did not immediately validate or relieve. As operations continued deeper into Germany, Black American troops encountered civilians who had been raised on Nazi racial ideology, yet who now faced armed Black soldiers as representatives of the victorious Allied powers. This inversion carried psychological weight on both sides, challenging enemy propaganda while simultaneously highlighting the contradictions of American segregation. During World War II, the United States positioned itself as a defender of freedom, yet the men enforcing that victory were often denied basic rights and recognition by their own nation. Patton's leadership style, defined by relentless pressure and intolerance for hesitation, meant that Black units under his command were rarely allowed respite. He believed constant engagement hardened soldiers and prevented complacency, a philosophy that resulted in extended combat rotations and high casualty rates. For Black American soldiers, this intensity carried additional meaning. Each mission was not only an order to be obeyed, but another opportunity to demonstrate competence under circumstances designed to expose weakness. In this environment, ruthlessness was not cruelty, but survival, and discipline became a form of resistance against a system that expected failure. The narrative surrounding these units during World War II was carefully managed. Official press releases rarely highlighted race, focusing instead on unit designations and battlefield outcomes. When individual acts of heroism were acknowledged, they were often framed without context that would challenge segregationist norms. Awards were delayed, downgraded, or denied altogether, not because of lack of merit, but because recognition carried political consequences. The silence surrounding these contributions was itself a form of control, limiting the impact their success could have on public consciousness during the war years. Despite these constraints, word spread among soldiers at the front. White infantry units supported by black tank crews learned quickly that reliability under fire mattered more than skin color. Shared danger fostered mutual respect that official policy could not legislate. In the mud and smoke of World War II battlefields, practical experience undermined abstract prejudice, creating informal bonds that contrasted sharply with the rigid segregation enforced in rear areas and stateside bases. These interactions, though rarely recorded in official histories at the time, formed the human foundation for later changes in military culture. As the European campaign drew closer to its conclusion, the accumulation of evidence became impossible to ignore. Black American soldiers had fought in every major phase of the advance, from the breakout in France to the crossing of the Rhine. Their endurance under sustained combat conditions challenged the myth that they lacked the psychological resilience required for modern warfare. In World War II, where industrialized killing tested the limits of human endurance, these soldiers demonstrated adaptability, courage, and cohesion equal to any unit in the Allied armies. The fear that had once surrounded their deployment shifted in character. No longer centered on battlefield performance, it became fear of precedent. Military leaders understood that acknowledging the full scope of black contributions would invite questions about segregation not only in the Army, but in the broader structure of American society. World War II had mobilized millions, reshaped economies, and altered global power, and the return of black veterans would add another destabilizing force to a nation already facing post-war adjustment. The battlefield victories of these soldiers carried implications that extended into politics, labor, and civil rights.
Within Patton's personal correspondence, traces of this tension can be discerned. While his public statements remained blunt and dismissive, his operational decisions reflected an acceptance of black combat units as reliable tools of war. He continued to assign them critical missions, indicating trust born of necessity rather than ideology. This duality illustrates a broader pattern within the military during World War II, where institutional racism persisted even as operational realities undermined its justification. The war forced changes that individuals alone might never have chosen. The experiences of these soldiers also exposed the limits of battlefield equality. Even as they advanced into enemy territory, Black American troops often faced segregation in liberated towns, restrictions on recreation, and unequal access to facilities controlled by their own military police. The contrast between fighting Nazi racial doctrine abroad and enduring discrimination at home sharpened their awareness of injustice. World War II thus became not only a fight against external tyranny, but a catalyst for internal reckoning, one that would continue long after the armistice. By the time Germany surrendered, the contributions of Black American soldiers had been woven into the fabric of victory, though often without acknowledgement. Their presence in key operations demonstrated that the success of World War II depended on mobilizing all available talent, regardless of race. The reluctance to fully recognize this truth did not diminish its reality. Instead, it delayed a confrontation that would resurface with greater intensity in the post-war years as veterans returned home, carrying both pride of service and the frustration of unfulfilled promises. The transformation initiated by their service did not occur overnight, but its momentum was irreversible. Military planners reviewing World War II campaigns could not erase the records of Black unit performance, nor could they ignore the strategic advantages gained by utilizing experienced, disciplined soldiers regardless of race.
These facts would influence debates that culminated in the eventual desegregation of the armed forces, a decision shaped as much by wartime necessity as by moral argument. The fear that once accompanied their deployment ultimately gave way to an acknowledgement that the Army's future depended on change. In this sense, the ruthlessness attributed to these soldiers was not a product of aggression alone, but of determination forged under systemic pressure. They fought not only to defeat an external enemy, but to assert their place within an institution that doubted them at every step. World War II provided the stage on which this struggle played out, transforming individual acts of courage into collective proof that could not be undone. Their legacy persists as a reminder that the outcomes of war are shaped not only by strategy and technology, but by the social forces that determine who is allowed to fight and on what terms. The impact of Black American soldiers during World War II extended beyond the battlefield into the very culture of the U.S. Army, influencing training methods, leadership selection, and operational doctrine. Commanders began to observe that the performance of segregated units like the 761st Tank Battalion was not an anomaly, but evidence of untapped potential within the ranks. This realization gradually prompted small, practical adjustments. Opportunities for leadership were cautiously expanded, technical training for Black soldiers was improved, and frontline assignments, once considered inappropriate, were increasingly trusted to capable individuals regardless of race. These changes were uneven and often resisted, but they laid the groundwork for a transformation that would slowly permeate military institutions. Even as these adjustments occurred, the human stories of World War II Black soldiers continued to unfold in extraordinary circumstances. In the dense forests and narrow streets of German towns, tank crews and infantrymen faced ambushes, mines, and artillery barrages that demanded instantaneous decision-making. Units often operated with minimal support, navigating both physical obstacles and communication difficulties that tested cohesion. The soldiers' ability to adapt under fire became a hallmark of their effectiveness. Their ruthlessness was a function of necessity. Hesitation could not only result in mission failure, but in the deaths of comrades. Every action taken on these battlefields reflected a combination of training, experience, and an acute awareness of the symbolic weight they carried as Black American troops, proving their worth in a segregated military. The psychological dimension of their service was equally profound. Soldiers contended with the knowledge that their successes would be scrutinized and their failures amplified. Propaganda and news accounts, often filtered through racial biases, could misrepresent their achievements or obscure them entirely. Despite these pressures, the men persisted, driven by a combination of personal pride, unit loyalty, and a sense of historical responsibility. Their presence on the front lines was simultaneously an act of service and an assertion of humanity, challenging the assumptions that had long defined their treatment within the military and the nation at large. Interactions between Black and white soldiers in combat zones added another layer of complexity to World War II's social dynamics. While segregation remained official policy, battlefield necessity forced collaboration and mutual reliance. White officers and enlisted men who had never shared quarters or mess halls with Black soldiers learned to respect their capabilities under extreme conditions. These experiences fostered informal recognition of competence and courage that contrasted sharply with official attitudes. The lessons learned on the battlefield would reverberate in post-war debates about integration and equality, illustrating that first-hand experience could sometimes overcome deeply entrenched prejudice more effectively than formal policy. Medical and logistical challenges further underscore the unique pressures faced by Black American soldiers. Combat injuries, mechanical breakdowns, and supply shortages affected all units, but Black soldiers often received delayed medical attention, inferior equipment, or less experienced support personnel. These obstacles demanded resilience and improvisation. World War II armored warfare and infantry maneuvers required not only physical stamina, but intellectual engagement, including quick tactical thinking, understanding of terrain, and coordination with Allied units. The ability of Black troops to overcome these challenges further reinforced the evidence of their capability and reliability. Recognition, while limited during the war, gradually began to materialize. Certain acts of valor and technical achievement were eventually acknowledged through decorations and citations, although often inconsistently and belatedly. Histories written in the immediate post-war years frequently minimized or overlooked these contributions, reflecting a combination of lingering racial bias and the complexities of documenting large-scale operations. Nevertheless, the cumulative impact of Black American soldiers' service during World War II was undeniable. They altered perceptions, challenged institutional assumptions, and provided a precedent for the broader integration of the military that would follow in subsequent decades. The influence of these soldiers extended beyond immediate military outcomes. Their presence in key operations disrupted enemy expectations and contributed directly to tactical successes. German forces encountering Black American units on multiple fronts were sometimes unsettled by the unexpected racial composition of troops wielding overwhelming firepower and coordinated strategy. This psychological factor, though not often emphasized in traditional military analysis, played a subtle but real role in shaping the dynamics of engagement. World War II was fought not only with guns and tanks, but with perception and morale, and Black soldiers proved that ability and courage transcended racial prejudice. As the Allies moved into the heart of Germany, the integration of Black soldiers into demanding missions became increasingly normalized, if still begrudgingly accepted. Units that had been marginalized at the beginning of the war were now critical components of offensives that required precise coordination and sustained aggression. Their performance demonstrated that segregation was a constraint imposed by policy, not by capability. Commanders observed that the discipline, initiative, and tactical understanding of Black soldiers met or exceeded expectations, further eroding the rationale for racial discrimination within the Army. In the home front, news of Black soldiers' service began to filter into African American communities, inspiring pride and fueling early civil rights activism. Letters, photographs, and personal accounts conveyed not only the experiences of battle, but the contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied basic rights at home. World War II created a platform from which Black Americans could assert claims for equality, leveraging the undeniable evidence of their contributions to demand recognition, respect, and political change. The battlefield had become a crucible in which both military skill and social legitimacy were forged. The strategic significance of these units cannot be overstated. From armored breakthroughs to infantry support in urban combat, Black American soldiers were integral to operations that directly influenced the course of World War II. Their reliability under extreme conditions enabled commanders like Patton to maintain momentum, exploit weaknesses, and sustain pressure on German forces. Without their participation, the dynamics of the Third Army's campaign and the broader European theater might have unfolded differently, highlighting that the contributions of marginalized soldiers were not peripheral, but essential to the Allied war effort.